Anyway, I want to welcome everybody to a very special presentation hosted by the South Fork Natural History Museum. I'm Frank Quevedo. I'm the executive director of the museum. And it's just great that our presenter tonight, Dr. Judith Weis, is available to present this incredible program titled Microplastics, They're Everywhere. And what does that mean? And Dr. Judith Weis is here to explain that to us. So before I introduce Judy, I just want to give you a quick background on her credentials. It's just very simple and quick. If we wanted to move forward on everything that you've done, Judy, we'd be here an hour before your presentation begins. But Dr. Judith Weis is a professor emerita of biological sciences at Rutgers University in Newark. Her research is on estuarine ecology and ecotoxicology. And she's published many books and has gone through and cited and refereed many scientific papers. And we're very, very happy to have her here tonight. So Dr. Judith Weis, thank you so much. And the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to share the screen now to get my PowerPoint up. Okay, does everybody see it?
Yep.
Okay, so we're talking about microplastics this evening. And before we get into details about microplastics, we need to answer a question, but I can't get the slide to move. Let me go back. I've got a problem getting, okay, got to the next slide. So actually, what is plastic? We better talk about that first. It's generally produced from oil, and it's got a variety of different chemicals. But what the thing that makes it that makes it plastic is that you get these individual chemicals. These are carbons and hydrogens, and this is ethylene. And you take all these ethylenes and string them up together, which makes what's called a polymer. You can see the same general thing over here. This is just representing some bunch of things. That's a monomer, but then you string them all together and you have a polymer. Okay, so that's what a polymer is. I just said that. So each links to the next, you get a long repeated chain. And the names of the plastic would be polypropylene, polyethylene, polystyrene, and so forth. And they have different properties depending on what the starting point, the monomer, was. But in addition to that, there's also a bunch of additive chemicals put in there, such as bisphenol A, which is used in toys and beverage containers and liners of food containers. This chemical is pretty notoriously known as an endocrine disruptor. And so they stopped using it and they substituted another one, which is BPS, but it turns out BPS has the same problems. Other additives include phthalates, which makes the plastic more flexible, but it also has effects on the reproductive system. Phthalates is what you have when you have the so-called new car smell. It's because the phthalates are in the upholstery of the seats of the automobile. The manufacture of plastic and its destruction by incineration pollutes the air, land, and water, exposes workers to toxic chemicals. And when the plastic eventually, which may be hundreds of years, when it eventually degrades, it releases greenhouse gases. So we've got, pollution coming at all stages in the whole life cycle of plastic. A very recent study just a month ago that came out looked at the additives that were put into the plastic and said there was more than 10,000 different substances that can be used in plastic. And over 2,400 of them are substances they call substances of potential concern, which means they're either persistent in the environment or they bioaccumulate in organisms, or they are toxic. So the vast majority of these chemicals are not adequately regulated throughout most of the world. Some of them are actually approved for food use contact in some places. So this is calling attention to these additive chemicals that one doesn't think about very often. Here's some common polymers that are used for different things. Polyethylene is for plastic bags. Polypropylene is in bottle caps and fishing ropes and so forth. Polystyrene is in plastic utensils, and on and on and on. Different ones for different uses. And okay. And these different kinds of plastic and different products made from it, these have a long life cycle. Many of them do not degrade in the environment for hundreds of years, as you can see in this diagram. A plastic bag will break down in about 20 years, but all these other things, coffee cup 30 years, but all these others are in the hundreds of years before they will chemically break down. Now we get to microplastics. Microplastics, this is a magnified picture. As you can see, the penny is giving you an indication of the sizes of some of the larger pieces that fit into the category of microplastics. They're defined as particles smaller than 5 millimeters and going all the way down to things that really cannot be seen without a pretty powerful microscope. And they come from different sources. They come from the breakdown of larger particles. They come from fibers from synthetic fabrics that come off in washing machines. They come off of tires as you are driving along the road. Your tire, eventually, you need to replace it because it's gotten thin, the treads are thin, and that hasn't just vanished. The rubber and plastic that made up that tire hasn't vanished. It's given off tiny pieces of it, which are the microplastics. And then there's micro beads shown in this picture that are spherical. Now, anything spherical is really a piece of plastic, would not be natural. And these are made to be used in various kinds of products, personal care products, like facial scrubs and toothpaste and things like that. And they're spherical. So you see all different kinds of shapes from the breakdown of things. They tend to be eaten by plankton, by shellfish, by fish. They get into the food chain in the aquatic environment. And plus the fact that toxic chemicals that might be in the water will glom on and attach to the microplastics. So these plastics are considered a route or so-called vector for getting toxic chemicals into the food chain. And then here's the micro beads in the personal care products. These have been phased out throughout most of the world. We had a 2015 law that Obama signed that prohibited their future use in this country. Another look at microplastics, they can be categorized into primary microplastics, which arrive in the environment already as tiny pieces, or secondary microplastics that are derived from the breakup of larger pieces. They come in a huge variety of shapes and colors and sizes, and there are different chemical types, as we mentioned, like polyethylene, polystyrene, etc. And because of these differences between the chemicals, some of these microplastic particles float and some sink. Some are denser than others. Looking at the breakup of larger pieces, one of the very common sources of microplastics from breaking up and fragmenting is styrofoam, because it's so flexible and soft and easily breaks. So it flies around in the wind, it floats, breaks into tiny pieces very easily, and litters the beaches. And then we have plastic bags on the right that break up into smaller and smaller pieces. One plastic bag could become over 1 million microscopic fragments. And as they're breaking up, toxic chemicals can leach out from the plastic. And then other things like bottles, things that are more rigid plastic, will more slowly, but eventually also break into microplastics. Now, scientists have always, well, I mean, this has only been studied for about a decade intensively. I mean, it was reported about microplastics before that, but intensive study has only been for about a decade. And a lot of attention has been paid to how to count how many of you got in your lake, or how many have we got in our estuary, and so forth. And there are studies from all over the world counting microplastics in various water bodies. And there is no standard method for doing this. So the numbers are very variable, regardless, and undoubtedly inaccurate. One of the issues of collecting microplastics in order to count them is how to collect them. And a very common way of collecting them is pulling a net. This is called a manta net. It's a type of plankton net that you have a net here. This thing runs along the surface of the water, and then the water comes through the net and stuff gets stuck on the inside of the net. And here's a magnification of what a net would look like. And when I was still an undergraduate and took marine ecology, we learned that plankton that are very long and thin, or at least just very thin, are not accurately counted when you put them through a net, because they tend to go through. Very small things will go through the pores in the net, and thin things are likely to go through the pores of the net. And the same holds true for microplastics of different shapes. Here's another more quantitative study. When you collect with these kind of nets, you get a smaller number of plastics of large size, because that's what you're selecting for. You're selecting for the big ones. As you put it through a more a finer sieve, you end up catching more, including more of a smaller size. And then if you don't do a sieve at all, but you put it on you filter it through a filter, collect it all in a bottle of water and pour it through a filter, which is much finer than any of these nets, you end up collecting a much larger number of microplastics and smaller sized ones. So what you get depends on how you collect it. And people are using various different collecting methods, so it's impossible to compare one study with another. Looking at the shapes and the counting, when you do whole water samples through a filter, it will show that the most common shape by far is the long, thin microfibers. So microfibers are a particular type of microplastic that are long and thin. When you sample from nets, you don't see the predominance of microfibers because they're more likely to go through the holes of the net. Someone has estimated that the plankton nets may underestimate the concentration of the microplastic fibers by 3 to 4 orders of magnitude. That's a huge amount. An order of magnitude is not the same as 3 to 4 times as many, but I mean, if you get 3 to 4 orders of magnitude would be, add 3 zeros to the 1 and you get 3 orders of magnitude. So this is a huge inaccuracy in the plankton using the nets. A meta-analysis is a study that looks at previous studies and compares a whole lot of previous studies. And they found that the average of all these studies in the water was 52% fibers, followed by 29% fragments. And all the other shapes were pretty rare, being the spheres, the films, foams, and so forth, all making up a small proportion. So that's a sort of a analysis of many, many different studies. So once you've got them collected, and hopefully you collect them in a way that will be more accurate rather than more inaccurate, what do you do to count them? Well, a lot of groups use microscopes, but microscopes have been found to have a very high error rate in the counting. There are sophisticated chemical equipment with various names. These are kinds of spectroscopy chemical equipment that gives you a much more accurate counting, and will also tell you what polymer it is. So this is, a sophisticated, expensive piece of equipment, and available at universities and private chemical laboratories. It's not something that the average person or school group or citizen science project would have. It's important, as stressed in this particular paper from a couple of years ago, to not consider microplastics as a pollutant or a contaminant, but consider them a suite that is a group of contaminants, because they differ from each other in many ways. They differ in abundance, they differ in shape, they differ in color, they may aggregate, they have different sizes, different ages, and different densities. Some will float and some will sink. So you can't think of it as one kind of pollutant. You've got to think of it as a category or suite of contaminants. And because these variable types of microplastics have different sources, different behavior in the environment, and different effects on living things. Here's another look at where they come from. As I said, any different analysis will show different proportions. And so this is really not totally accurate, but it's giving a general pie chart here. They're having clothing and textiles having the largest chunk, tires being the next largest chunk, city dust here, road markings, marine coatings, beauty products, and plastic nurdles. Nurdles are the small beads about the size of a lentil that are the thing that go into the manufacture of products of plastic. They take them in order to make plastic products. So these numbers are not to be taken as the literal truth, because different people will come up with different numbers. But again, the textile, the clothing, the fabrics come out top. So your laundry is causing pollution. The vast majority of microplastics in the world are coming from clothing. One item of synthetic clothing in one washing can release 100,000 microparticles, microplastic fibers. And after they're washed, you then put it in the dryer, and it's releasing microplastics into the air. So you can't win. Because the microplastics are everywhere, including 90% of our drinking water. There's more in bottled water, by the way, than in tap water. There's not much reason to use bottled water, in my opinion. In the washing machine, the microfibers get released because they are too small to get trapped in the standard filter, and too light to be caught in traps. Wastewater sewage treatment plants are able to filter out 90% of them, but what's left over that's going out with the water is so much still that millions and millions of these particles are reaching the waterways. When it is filtered out in a wastewater treatment plant, it ends up in the sludge. And sludge is often applied to agricultural fields as a fertilizer. And so that's one way it can get into our vegetables. Lots of these microfibers from the laundry end up in our water bodies, rivers, lakes, and oceans. And if there are chemical pollutants in the water, they can attach to the plastics. And they are also consumed by animals, small animals, plankton, fish, clams, and so forth, which are then in turn consumed by us. So we are getting microplastics in our seafood, as well as our water, as well as our vegetables. So here's a look. I mean, the microplastic, the microfibers are really lint. If you think of it, a drier lint, it's you know, the tiny pieces that are making up the lint, what falls off the clothes. One thing that's a useful piece of information if you're in the market for buying a new washing machine is that top loading machines release a lot more than front loaders. And even if you're not in the market for a new washing machine, you should know that hot water releases more than cool water, and a gentle cycle releases more, which it doesn't seem to make sense, but this is what people who studied this found. It would seem to be the opposite, but this is what they found. And old clothes more than new clothes, because old clothes are beginning to fray, and fraying is a good way of releasing more microplastics. So, I mean, here's a sort of schematic look. Here's your washing machine. Here's your item of clothing, and here's the microfibers coming off. And here you go, it's coming out the pipe. Here's all those microfibers into the water, and then gets eaten by the fish, and then the fish ends up on your dinner plate. So there's how it works. This one on the right is showing that different types of synthetic fabrics release more microfibers than others. And if you have a synthetic cotton blend, you are reducing the amount that is washed. And here, the conditioner increases the amount that gets released. Clothes at all stages are releasing microfibers. They're releasing microfibers before the textile has even been produced. When they're making the fiber that's going to go into the textile, microplastics are released. When the textile is made, while you're using it and wearing it, you don't have to be just washing it, you're wearing it. You walk around, you are shedding microfibers off your clothing just by walking around. And of course, when you get rid of your clothing, and then here's the washing machine issue, and going into the water, and if it's in sludge, it's going into terrestrial environment. And then we have all sorts of issues about health of the ecosystem, the toxicity due to the chemicals attached to this, and what's it doing to us. So that's the clothing story. We can just say that not all microfibers come from synthetics. You can see here, starting in 1980, and the gray is the increase in production from different kinds of fibers. And this is the polyester, which is now by far the greatest. You can see a significant chunk of fibers getting released from cotton. But cotton and wool, you do have their microfibers in the environment, but they will break down. They are bacteria and fungi and all can break them down much more readily than plastic microfibers. Another source of microplastics is astroturf, synthetic lawns, such as they put down at Lincoln Center this summer in New York City. People walking on it, dogs walking on it, kids playing on it is releasing tiny plastic fibers from this synthetic plastic lawn. Okay, focusing for a while on the food chain, microplastics in the food chain. Plankton and baby fish will eat microplastics. And you see here a baby fish, a fish larva, and these little spheres were fed to it. These are microplastic spheres and that you see lined up in its intestine. They readily eat them, and if they eat enough, their behavior can be changed. They're less able to avoid predators. Some animals even prefer eating plastics to food, which is kind of surprising and disappointing and sad. But they can then get passed up the food chain. So as a result, we've got microplastics in marine life worldwide, in drinking water and in the air. Most species studied have found to contain microplastic debris in their gut, and including many of the species that are popular in the food web, and also species that people like to eat, that many of them have been found to have plastics, microplastics in their digestive system. Here's just a picture of a planktonic crustacean, and it had in a laboratory, you can get microplastics to study experimentally that will be fluorescent, which enables you to more easily see them in an experimental study. So this little crustacean critter has eaten microplastics. And that comes the question, why? Why would animals want to eat them? And a couple of reasons. One is the color and size resembles the food they normally eat. And there is a fish called an amber striped scad that normally eats blue copepods. Copepods are a very common type of zooplankton animal. And the ones that are right near the surface tend to be blue. And this fish that's its favorite food. So if you present it with a piece of plastic that's the same size as the copepod, which would be a piece of microplastic, they will be very happy to eat those microplastics. This is not anywhere near as common as things being attracted by the odor of the plastic. And in the case of corals, corals prefer new virgin microplastics. This is, fresh microplastics, whereas most other animals prefer microplastic that's been in the environment for a while. And when microplastics are floating in a lake or in the ocean or in an estuary, they gather a bunch of things that will grow on it. Microscopic organisms cover them, and they're called a biofilm that will form on them. And very often, the microplastics with the biofilm are, for more organisms, more attractive because the odor of the biofilm. And here's anchovies, particularly attracted by the odor of the biofilm. Another thing is with the biofilm on them, they tend to become heavier and more likely to sink. So this is another, aspect of the studies on microplastics is looking at this biofilm. There's a lot of intense study on the biofilm that forms around the plastics. Here's the corals, individual coral animals that really prefer no biofilm. prefer brand new virgin plastics. Okay, I pose a question that I guess you're all muted, but you should think about this. Looking at these three pictures, here's the microspheres, here's fragments, and here's the microfibers. Which shape is more likely to be able to go right through the gut and out the other end without causing problems? Which is more likely to be able to cause tissue damage? And which is more likely to clog up the gut? I think you don't have to think too hard to see that here we have spheres that are smooth that can go right through and out pretty easily, whereas the fragments have sharp edges and could indeed cause damage to the tissues. And here you have a mess of fibers which can easily form a clog up the gut. So there are big differences among the different shapes of microplastics. They have found plastics in the stomach of deep sea. These are animals living way down in the deep sea, have been found to have microplastics. And the deep trenches, and it's always microfibers. The microfibers tend to be of the type of plastic like polyester or something that's heavier. So they are more likely to sink. And the fact that you've seen animals in various parts of the deep sea with contamination suggests that it's everywhere. It's not just an isolated thing. And this is a microscopic animal called an arrowworm from the deep sea. And you can see a blue microfiber inside this animal. So again, animals come from nearly 7 miles deep. And again, finding them all over implies that it's a global, universal problem. There's probably no place that is free of microplastics by now. Deep sea organisms in general depend on food coming down from surface waters, which then, as the food, dead animals and so forth, comes down slowly, it's bringing plastic and pollutants with it as it slowly goes down, sinks to the deep sea and becomes food for these animals way down there. Looking at bivalves like mussels and clams, these are selective feeders. They're filter feeders, but they don't swallow everything that their filter catches. They are able to reject things they don't want as they're capturing it. So that stuff that's rejected is referred to as pseudo-feces. It's not true feces being poop. This is pseudo-poop. And most of the microfibers that they can't say they eat them because they're not really eating them, that they take in initially are rejected and go out in the pseudo-feces. And then much of the rest is fat, goes through their digestive system and then is in the feces and it's pooped out. In the case of freshwater zebra mussels, they ingest microplastics very readily, but they eliminate most of them. And the uptake is dependent on the concentration in the water. The more in the water, the more they eat. And if you give them real food, algae, at the same time, they won't take up as much of the microplastics. There's also differences with selection and in terms of what chemical polymer microplastics they prefer. And if you look here, this is looking at different polymers, and it's the PET that they tend to want to eat, and fibers of the PET, and these others are much more scarce. And then if you look at polyester fibers of different size classes, you can see also that there's a particular preference for a certain size. They don't want them too big and they don't want them too small, and they eat mostly the ones in this intermediate size category. So we have quite selective things for animals that we think just eat everything that they are that's in the water. Oh wait, it's the wrong way. Okay, back here. Now, different shapes have a different accumulation and damage to the gut. This was a study where they compared beads, that's the spheres, and fragments and fibers. And they found that the accumulation in the gut, they accumulated mostly fibers, and then secondly, fragments, and thirdly, beads. And the effects that they saw, tissue damage and inflammation and stuff, were more severe for the microfibers than for the other shapes. So again, we can't look at these things as a single thing. They are very different in their effects. Again, in organisms, most of the microplastics in animals are the fibers and fragments, and a very small percentage are the beads. Beads is the same as spheres. And they're most in the gut. And most lab experimental studies use beads. This is a complaint of mine about the research in this field, where we find beads are very rare in the environment, but so many studies are still using them in experimental studies in the lab. When we see most of the microplastics in the animals are fibers, that could be because the concentrations in the animal are reflecting the proportions in the environment, but it could also reflect the fact that fibers are not eliminated as quickly as other shapes of the microplastics. So I say we need a lot more study about elimination, egestion, getting rid of these particles. We've had so many studies about ingestion, the animals are eating them, but let's look at the other end of the digestive system and see what proportion and how quickly they are eliminating them. Another interesting study looking at history, museum specimens. There's a collection of freshwater fish that dated back to the 1950s. And recently people were looking at in the guts of these ancient preserved fish, and found there were no microplastics in these freshwater fish before 1950. And then following 1950, the amounts were increasing and increasing. And all of the microplastics were fibers. And they were primarily polyester, but there were also some natural textiles like cotton microfibers as well. But they could see this steep, steady increase as the fish were caught later and later. So thinking about what problems can be caused. This is I just like this schematic of, this is an animal, okay? And what you're seeing is, this is the gut, this is the mouth end and the anus end there. And when you look at it as a schematic, you could say that materials in the gut are not really in the animal. You know, it's a passageway, and they're in the passageway. And what really counts is, do they get out of that passageway into the animal proper? And here's, a diagram of the body cells, and here's absorption out of the gut into the real, if I could say that, body cells. So this is it. And the degree and rate of egestion depends on not only the length and shape and so forth of the digestive tract, but also what kind of microparticles, plastics you're talking about. It seems like most of them pass through the fish digestive system and do not move into the tissues, but some do, and they're likely to be the smaller particles that can get through the walls of the intestine and into the animal. This was an interesting study. I thought this was really interesting. How to get rid of ingested microfibers. Study on the shrimp. Shrimp and other crustaceans have an organ called a gastric mill, which processes things that have come into the digestive system. And what the shrimp, and I'm sure other shrimp and other crustaceans do also, is separate out the microspheres and sends the microspheres down the digestive system and out, and poops out the microspheres, whereas it sends the fibers back where they came from. So these all mixture comes in through the mouth. Here's the gastric mill that's sorting them out, sending the spheres out to be pooped out. And meanwhile, then the microfibers are getting regurgitated. So this is an animal that is separating out the spheres from the fibers and sending them different ways in its digestive system. I thought this was really cool. All right, a little bit more critique of some of the lab effect studies. The most common material that's used in the lab studies is polystyrene, which is not very common in the environment. Most of the lab studies use concentrations that are far greater than those found in the environment. Most of these studies use spheres, which are now very rare in the environment. The reason for this is you can purchase them for your laboratory, and you can purchase standards. You get them in a little vial, and you can get standard sizes. You can get them that are fluorescent. You know, you can specify lots of things about them. But again, this is very rare in the environment, and it's not realistic. A lot of these lab studies using high concentrations are finding effects on the biochemistry and the genetics and development and growth and behavior. But if you expose animals to a huge high concentration of lots of things, you will find effects that may not occur if you use environmentally relevant concentrations. And some of these studies don't provide food, and you find the animals are not growing well and are stressed. Well, maybe it's because they're just not getting food, and you're seeing effects of starvation, and of course saying it's because of the plastic, which is not quite true. So I put out a call for let's make the studies more realistic. And the next thing I wanted to mention is about the contaminants that are associated with it. We've got all these chemicals that are part of the microplastics. That could be these phthalates we talked about, and BPA and BPDEs. Plus we have chemicals that may be in the environment, like PCBs and metals and PAHs, that may attach to it. So you've got two different types of chemicals. Those that are put into the microplastic itself for one reason or another, and those from the environment that stick on the outside. And these are commonly studied, but microfibers coming from textiles have additional and different kinds of chemicals than some of these others. Chemicals such as dyes that are put in there for the fact that this is going to be clothing. And so there's a different collection of chemicals that are not generally studied, even though the microfibers are the most common environmental microplastics. And a lot of these dyes are quite toxic. Studies on questioning with regard to these chemicals, as the microplastic passes through the digestive system of an animal, are the chemicals likely to come off or stay on? If they stay on and the plastic gets pooped out and the chemicals are all staying stuck on, then we don't really have a problem. But in this study, they showed that the chemical pollutants that were on there got stripped off. Here's here's your microplastic with the PBDEs attached to it. Because in the fish cleans off, and here's the chemical in the fish, and the microplastics get pooped out. So in this particular study, they did act as what we call a vector for transferring these chemicals into the organisms. A basic question we need to ask is, which types of chemicals are more likely to get released from which types of microplastics in which kind of animals during the time that it passes through their digestive system? Another question that people have been studying is how much bioaccumulation of the chemical from the fish eating plastic compares with the amount of the chemical they would get from eating real food, that is living their normal prey. And it's quite clear that chemicals are much more likely to be released from real food than from the plastics. So this is an active field of research. They found, here's another case where it did get released in the digestive system of this bird. It's a fulmar, a bird, that those that ate plastic and eventually pooped it out had this chemical PBDE in their livers. And those that didn't eat plastic didn't have PBDE in their livers. So that's pretty clear evidence that this particular chemical does come off in the gut of this bird. An important issue is what's called trophic transfer, when an animal accumulates some of the microplastics and then gets eaten by a predator, and then they get eaten by a next level predator. So to what degree can microplastics of different types, sizes, and shapes be transferred to the gut of tissues and then through the food web? And this is, I think, important studies that are just beginning to happen. Microplastics have also been found in gills of aquatic animals. And this has not been studied as much. I think it's likely that they could remain in the gills for a longer time than they remain in the gut. And this may end up being more important as a serious route of intake than the eating. But this is something needing a lot more study. And the fact that it's in the respiration and in the gills suggests that we need to look at respiration in terrestrial and soil animals, as well as all these aquatic animals, since microplastics are all over in the air and soil. In the air, we have the issue of being released from dryers, in the lint and so forth, and then some getting blown out in the air. And also, again, falling off your clothes as you're walking around. And then once in the air, there's a whole cycle of exchange with the sea, transport by the wind, carrying, you're finding microplastic in the polar regions when nobody was there. You're finding it in areas where nobody far away from anybody. So there's long distance transport of all this stuff. So in the air, we are inhaling and eating microplastics. There's no doubt about this. We are ingesting them, we're inhaling them. We may be taking some in from our skin. We're getting it from food, cosmetics, dust, medicines, and clothes. And then there are all these potential issues. What effect is this having on people? And the short answer is we don't know. We don't know. We realize that microplastics are found in the lungs. We also know that textile workers who are exposed to huge amounts, far more than all the rest of us, they get coughing and wheezing and lung issues. on asthma and inflammation and so forth. But that's again with very high exposures. There's a new study, but it's a very preliminary thing with lung tissue culture in the lab, exposing these lung cells to nylon and polyester microfibers, and saw a decrease in growth of these lung in tissue culture. And it was nylon had an effect and polyester didn't. This is a very preliminary study, and it doesn't say that your lungs are going to get, you're going to develop lung cancer because of inhaling microplastic fibers. Some solutions, people are looking into solutions. There is a filter called a lint lover filter that can be purchased and attached to your washing machine that collects the vast majority of the microfibers, 90%. There is this thing that you can buy for a small amount of money called a Coraball that you can just put in your washing machine with the clothes, and it collects some, but it's only 30%. And then there's also this thing called a Guppy Friend Bag. If you put your clothes in this bag and put the bag in the washing machine, the bag is supposed to trap a lot of the microfibers, but it appears to have to collect even less than the Coraball does. But this filter is really good. And the textile and clothing companies are well aware of these problems, and they are working on it. And there are studies going on in the industry about which kind of blends release how much fibers, and developing fabrics that would shed less, and better technologies to catch more in coming out of the washing machine. Developing clothing from biodegradable plastics. I hope that all the companies working on solutions should be careful not to cause new problems, because there's a long history in trying to fix something where you fix something and your replacement is still causing a problem, maybe the same one, maybe different ones. So there should be caution about all of this. Re-engineering textiles, change the way they're manufactured, including coatings that could perhaps reduce shedding fibers. They're working on quantifying the shedding from different kinds of fabrics, deciding which fabrics are the worst shedders, and trying new approaches to construction of the yarn and fabric in the first place. So all this is going on. As cautioned by the former chair of the textile department at Fashion Institute of Technology, changing the twist or the fiber length or fiber type and so forth affects the aesthetic, the performance, and the cost of the product. And this whole thing, he concluded, was a humongous problem. Here's just one example of re-engineering textiles. These people created found that a protein isolated from squid suckers. Now, why they ever thought to examine squid suckers, I have no idea. But when they put that protein on the fabric, here they had cut the fabric into 3 pieces. And when it was coated, you put the 3 together and they stick together. And also it reduced the shedding of microfibers from the fabric because it was, sort of gluing it together better. That's just one example. Another one was just improving encapsulating the fuzz on fleeces by putting a layer, covering the fleece with another layer of cloth, so that the fleece is still there, but it's not on the outside. You've got a tighter fabric, both on the inside and outside of the fleece. So that's pretty elementary, and it does certainly reduce fiber shedding. I'm not The bill is very complicated, and I am not going to give you the details, but it includes a ban on lots of single-use products. It includes extended producer responsibility, meaning the people that make the product are responsible for the recycling or whatever is going to be done with it. And there's a bottle bill as part of this, and so forth. So here's all the good things this Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act will do. There's a major campaign to try to push this through. It's likely that it will be broken into different parts and not ever being passed as the whole thing, but we'll see. And finally,
Judy, your shared screen disappeared. Was that done on purpose?
no, it wasn't.
We only see you now. We don't see anything that you have.
All right, I'm on my last slide, and I will just read it then. I don't know what happened here. Something screwy happened a couple slides ago. What you can do, choose natural fabrics like cotton or silk as much as possible. Wash synthetics as rarely as possible. Wash in cold water, use less detergent, and avoid the delicate setting. Use front-loading washing machines. Dry your clothes on a clothesline if possible. Don't do your laundry so often, wash full loads. Install that filter. The filter is really good, or use the Guppy bag or laundry ball. And finally, looking back at where the microplastics came from, aside from clothing, when you're at a restaurant, ask them not to bring you a straw. Take a refillable water bottle wherever you go, so you don't have to use Poland Spring or these others. Ask takeout places to not give you the plastic forks and spoons unless you're picnicking. But if you're taking the takeout and going home, you have your own utensils. You don't need that. Get your shampoo as a bar, not a bottle. Get laundry detergent as strips. So those are a bunch of things that you can do. And I'm done. And I don't know what happened with the slides, but as long as you can still hear me, we can have a conversation.
Yeah, no, that was fantastic. We lost that last slide, or the last.
Yeah, well, I read it, so that last slide didn't have to be seen if it.
Okay. Well, I was reminding everyone that was listening to your fabulous presentation to write in any questions in the chat box. And I have one question so far from Kim Bambino. And she asked the question, there was a movement a few years ago to bring awareness to fast fashion, in quotes, these manufacturers who are making cheap synthetic disposable clothing.
Yes.
Had any effect?
You mean, are people stop buying these things? I don't know, but I'm quite aware of that movement, and very supportive of it. I hope it's having an effect, but I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't know the answer to that either. So
yeah, I don't know either. But there just seems to be so many stores from H&M to Zara, and all of them. They're just so incredibly inexpensive, and these kids today are just buying these T-shirts and wearing them once and throwing it away. And you see these landfills with piles and piles and piles of clothes, and it's gut-wrenching.
It is. It absolutely is. And I hope, increased awareness about this whole thing. It's not just the microplastic pollution, it's so many other pollution issues, the chemicals, the dyes and so forth, and the clothes, and the sheer wastefulness of it. I think it's terrible. And I hope this is having some effect, reducing the use of this fast fashion.
Yeah. Thank you.
thanks, Kim. Thanks for the question. Anybody else have a question? If you have a question and you don't want to write it in the chat box, just unmute yourself and ask Dr. Weis the question. So we'll just give everybody a few seconds to see if they want to ask any questions, Dr. Weis. There was an earlier question about, somebody had asked about what are micro, let me see what I got here. But you answered their question, wherever it was, you answered it.
Okay.
So I'm not going to repeat it. So anyway, I think that's pretty much concludes your presentation. Oh, there is another question here. Oh, thank you for your presentation. That was the question. Somebody just wanted to thank you.
I actually do have a question. Is there any
Yeah.
way to send us that last slide of all those helpful hints?
Let me see if I can put it back on.
And are there any other websites we can go to educate our kids?
Oh, yeah, there's millions of things. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Something screwy happened. It's right near the end. I don't know what it was. But we could leave this up there and you can jot it down if you
No,
want.
I took a photograph.
Oh, that's good. Screenshot.
I saved the paper.
Yeah, very good.
Very good. Yeah. So there's a question here from Elaine Giesel. I hope I pronounced it right. Is it possible? Hold on. Is it possible that the larger portion of microfibers from the delicate cycle is from the type of materials that we wash delicate?
Oh, that's a really good thought. It's probably, I would imagine that you're right. That makes a lot of sense because a delicate fabric would sound like one that would be more likely to be releasing more fibers.
Yeah.
That's a great idea.
Very good point.
Yeah.
This is Elaine. I mean, it makes sense to me, and not avoiding the delicate cycle, which has a shorter wash time, a less vigorous wash time, and it doesn't even spin as much to dry off moisture. That would be an improvement over the regular hard cycle. So I'm not sure that recommendation makes a lot of sense not to use the delicate cycle. Unless we have more data on that.
There was data. This was a surprise to the investigators also.
I wonder if they tried all different kinds of fabrics separately.
I don't know. I really don't know, but you know what you said before makes a whole lot of sense. But again, if you buy fabric that's recommended to go in the delicate setting, and you don't use the delicate setting and you put the fabric in the regular wash, it's going to release even more, presumably.
I would think so.
Yeah. So
I would love to see that original study.
Yeah, well, I can probably figure out where it is, but I think I could find it. But it's maybe the advice ought to be don't buy fabrics that recommend a delicate setting. That might be a better piece of advice.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Anybody else join in here and unmute yourselves and ask Dr. Weis a question? Nothing in the chat, nothing in the chat box anymore. So if nobody has any more questions,
I guess we're done.
I guess we're done. Dr. Weis, thank you so much for a very, very informative presentation. Really appreciate taking the time for us.
Thanks very much, everybody, for coming.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see everyone soon. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Good night, everyone. Thank you.